Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, today we're going to go back to Dr. Mike. He's a channel we haven't looked at for quite some time. This one looks really interesting. It has to do with history. And he's got 14 million subscribers, so I feel like a lot of you have probably already seen this one. This is What Killed Every Dictator. I'll put the link down in the description so you can check it out and check out the rest of his channel without my commentary. Let's dive into this one.
While humankind has endured the wrath of countless dictators, warlords, and tyrants, we can take solace in the fact that all of them are dead. Well, at least the ones in this video. Often,
all the ones that have previously lived are dead.
History's most despicable people died in extraordinary fashion. Deadly brawls on white sandy beaches, highly orchestrated political revenge killings, and even a bloodthirsty woman?
Mary.
I guess evil comes in all shapes, sizes, and genders. Also, we got to give a huge thank you to Oxford medical historian Lindsay Fitzharris for helping us research this video. Check out our channel, link down below. Let's start with the most famous and perhaps most controversial entry on this list. Adolf Hitler, who died by his own
Uh-oh, you just got demonetized for saying his name.
own hands within his secret bunker in Berlin. Probably. As the
Probably.
Soviets were closing in on the Nazis, Hitler...
So there's a scene there of the Reichstag. It's really cool to visit that area, and you're not very far. If you go visit the Reichstag in Berlin, you just walk a couple hundred yards. You go past the Brandenburg Gate. You go over to this little apartment complex, and there is a sign there that talks about the Reichschancellery and the bunker, and you can stand pretty much in the exact spot right above where it happened.
And his wife, Eva Braun, used a gun and cyanide capsules to seal the deal before they could be captured. Per Hitler's wishes from a hastily written will, he and Braun were to be burned. However, the bodies were only partly destroyed by the petrol used and were later quickly buried in a shallow bomb crater as the Soviets approached. The Russians...
Yeah, you got to remember that by the time this all goes down, the Soviets are already entering Berlin. And so everything is like done quickly and done without the level of care that they normally would have taken. And so if the traditional story is to be believed, and there's plenty of reason to believe it, they're thrown, just this happens, they carry the bodies out, they throw them in a ditch, they douse gasoline, petrol on it, light them on fire, but it's not as easy as one might think to cremate a human body, so plenty left over.
Exhumed Hitler's remains and threw them in a river to prevent the burial site from becoming a shrine for fascists. However, the Red Army kept a portion of the jaw and a fragment of skull with a bullet hole and took them to Moscow. And they still have them. In 2017, the Russian government permitted a group of French pathologists to study the dental remains to confirm, in fact, they did belong to Hitler. Benito Mussolini.
Yeah, I mean, we've got male line relatives of Hitler alive in the United States. Their last name is now Stuart Houston. So Adolf had a brother, a half-brother, same father, so Y chromosome DNA would match, who lived in the UK. And then his son, known as Willie Hitler, William Patrick Hitler, actually was in the U.S. Navy during World War II, and then had 3 sons of his own, and they changed their name to Stuart Houston. I don't know if any or all 3 are still alive, but they lived in New York last I knew, and none of them ever had any children. But if any of them are still living, their Y chromosome DNA could be used to match that of those dental records.
The strongman prime minister of Italy for 20 years, running a fascist government that silenced opponents with violence and assisted Hitler in trying to take over all of Europe. He sucked. As the Allied forces closed in...
And he was a elementary school teacher long before he became a fascist dictator.
...and brought an end to the Axis powers, Mussolini attempted to flee Italy and escape to Spain. He didn't get far, getting captured while in disguise at Lake Como and ultimately sentenced to death by machine guns just 1 day later.
And what happened to Mussolini is the main reason why Hitler decided he wasn't going to be taken alive, because he didn't want to have the same thing happen to him.
His corpse, as well as those of his mistress and allies, were brought to Milan and tossed in the city square, where they were kicked, beaten, and spat on by the Italian.
And then hung upside down.
James Cook was a British explorer and owns the distinct honor of having the single most...
All right, well, I guess we're going to use the term dictator loosely here if Captain Cook's going to be added to this list.
exciting death in this entire video. Cook mapped a lot of the Pacific, exploring places like Tahiti, New Zealand, and Hawaii. By the time of his third great voyage, something in Cook seemed to have snapped. He began mistreating indigenous people, and some argue he was partly responsible for starting a genocidal era of British imperialism. Okay, so how did he die? Well, in 1779, Captain Cook was searching for the Northwest Passage, a naval route between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans that went over North America. He stumbled across the Hawaiian Islands and became a sensation. The native Hawaiians believed he was a deity and named him Lono. They offered him countless tributes and ceremonies in his honor. Eventually, the captain and his men overstayed their welcome. And then they ended up setting sail toward Alaska. Unfortunately, they encountered a storm and returned just 4 days later, needing to make some repairs onto their ships. Oops. A god crawling back with a broken ship 4 days later, that wasn't part of the legend the Hawaiians had believed about Lono, so tensions rose very quickly, leading to several instances of theft from his ships.
Isn't it amazing how quickly things can turn based on things that are out of your control? Something like a storm that causes you to go back and ends up costing you your life.
Had unfortunately developed a zero-tolerance policy towards indigenous people who disobeyed him. So he sailed to shore, climbed onto the beach, and stomped his way to town where, without warning, he kidnapped the king. Cook escorted the king back towards the ship through the steamy Hawaiian jungle, gathering an entourage of confused Hawaiians as they marched. By the time they got back to the beach, a large, angry crowd surrounded Cook, who could not swim. With tensions rising rapidly and a no doubt difficult language barrier, chaos broke out and a brawl on the beach ensued. There was
What did he think was going to happen?
Punching, kicking, clawing, biting, a real street fight under the hot sun. Cook swung left and right until he took a knife to the shoulder and a club to the back of the head. He fell forward into the shallows of the Pacific Ocean and was finished off by the violent Hawaiian mob. Despite the battle, Cook was still revered by the Hawaiians, and his lifeless body was taken back to the village where it was boiled and stripped of its flesh. A week later, Cook's remains were returned to the British, which were disposed of in the waters of the bay in the customary naval fashion. Aloha. Christopher Columbus was an Italian explorer who was
So basically we're doing dictators and explorers in this video. Fine, I mean, I get it. You want to add some people to the list to kind of fill it out a little bit.
Credited with discovering America, though the more technically accurate impact was establishing a permanent connection between Europe and the Western Hemisphere.
That's a great point. Obviously, I think most students of history by now know that Columbus was not the first European to set foot in what we today call the Americas. And listen, spare me the... I'm getting off on a tangent here, but a lot of, well, I shouldn't say a lot of people, but occasionally I see people taking issue with the fact that the United States gets called America. But what do you call the country to the south of the United States? If you call it Mexico, you're doing the exact same thing because they're the United States of Mexico. So same deal.
You can't exactly discover a place that already
United
has
Mexican
people on.
States.
His voyages to the New World were quite grim, enslaving, torturing, and bringing disease to hundreds of thousands of Caribbean natives in an attempt to deliver gold and glory to the Spanish crown that sponsored him. It's generally believed that he died in Spain in his mid-50s from some sort of heart failure, probably contributed to by a battle with gout. That being said, a number of experts revisited this claim hundreds of years after his death and proposed a new theory: Reiter syndrome, otherwise known as reactive arthritis, an autoimmune condition. He had some unique symptoms that matched the condition, including bouts of red bleeding eyes, intermittent blindness, and immobility from pain in his spine. These symptoms only worsened dramatically in his final years of life, when he and his men had to survive as castaways off the coast of Jamaica for 1 full year while trying to find the mythical lost city of gold. Treasure would have been great, but what he really should have been looking for was probably a leave.
Ooh.
Julius Caesar was the leader of Rome and one of the most dominant figures in all of human history. In fact, he is so synonymous with leadership that his name means leader in other languages, like Kaiser in Germany.
Which is actually how Julius Caesar's name was pronounced. It wasn't pronounced Caesar. In Latin, it would have been Kaiser. So Kaiser, Tsar,
or Tsar in Russian. His military campaigns resulted in the deaths of hundreds of thousands in his quest to expand the Roman Empire. His success and lust for...
But none of that happened, well, to be nitpicky here, I get he's not a historian. He wasn't expanding the Roman Empire. There was no Roman Empire at that time. It was the Roman Republic. And he didn't become a dictator until after those people had all been killed in wars, when he was a general and a governor.
Power fed off one another, and soon members of the Roman Senate grew concerned that he would turn the Roman Republic into a monarchy, anointing himself as king. Tensions were rising, and
which is ironic when you consider that the end result of their assassination of Hitler was the destruction of the Republic and the establishment of an empire under Caesar's adopted son.
Caesar's friends warned him of dissent within the Senate. He ignored these concerns and went anyway. Once there, one of the conspirators approached Caesar on the pretext of pleading for his exiled brother. He grabbed Caesar's toga, apparently signaling to the room that the assassination had begun.
And Caesar said something to the effect of, "What is this?" or "What is this violence?" or, he like, "What are you doing?" basically. And then people started slashing at him, and as many times as he was stabbed, most of the wounds weren't fatal.
Senators rushed in with blades, stabbing Caesar over and over, with each man fighting for the claim that he was the one who killed the emperor. Caesar was reportedly stabbed 35 times. No amount of IV fluids, blood transfusions, or pressors would help him there. As he died, he uttered some of his most famous last words. Et tu, Brute? You too, Brutus, to his longtime friend and perhaps illegitimate son who stood over him with a bloodied knife.
Unlikely to be his illegitimate son, though. Caesar did have a relationship with Brutus's mother and kind of saw him like a son.
Or maybe he said that. He certainly says it in William Shakespeare's tragedy, Julius Caesar, which was written 1,500 years later, but there's no proof he literally said that as he died in a pool of blood on the Senate floor.
No.
Still, it does make for a great story. Caligula was a relative of Caesar and a Roman ruler who was infamously called
an adopted relative. Well, it's complicated. Let me show you what I mean. So it's kind of a crazy family tree, and there's a lot of adoption going on. Caligula is descended from Mark Antony, and of course related to Nero and Augustus and all of them, but there's a lot of adoption going on, and you can see the little dashes where the adoptions are going on. And it's called the Julio-Claudian family tree, and we've done plenty of episodes about all of that.
The Mad Emperor, and for good reason. After taking power, he fell quite ill, and many experts speculated that he may have suffered from epilepsy, a brain disorder that causes recurrent seizures.
Well, we know that Julius Caesar most likely had epilepsy, but Caligula definitely had something happen, because if you look at his rule before and after the illness, there's a marked change in the guy.
He actually believed he was a god and killed randomly, beating a priest to death with a hammer during an animal sacrifice ritual just because. He nearly bankrupted Rome, spending endless cash on extravagant feasts and parties for himself, refilling the coffers by seizing property and assets from rich Romans.
Now, that part is not unusual. I mean, that had been done by countless leaders before Caligula. The prescriptions, as they were called, basically making a list of your enemies who had a lot of wealth and then confiscating it to refill the coffers. You actually see a scene of that in HBO's Rome, where you have Lepidus, Mark Antony, and Octavian making a list of people that are enemies, and there was actually some negotiations going on where you end up with like Cicero on the list, for example, because Mark Antony wanted him gone, and Octavian, who actually kind of like Cicero, had to give in to that, and I think somebody's brother ended up on the. It was crazy.
Eventually, when Caligula was just 28 years old, he was surrounded by a group of conspirators. One raised his sword and slashed the emperor between the collarbone and neck. Carotids, jugulars, lots of blood vessels, even more blood. Caligula tried to run away, but another enemy was lying in wait and knocked him to the ground with another sword strike. The plotters stabbed him 30 times, continuing to attack him well after he passed. Roman historian Cassius Dio claims they even tasted of his flesh.
Listen, Cassius Dio, like a lot of historians of his day, not to just automatically be believed when it comes to all this stuff. They liked to embellish.
The public demanded justice for Caligula, and his assassins were sentenced to death as well. Genghis Khan died somehow. After violently uniting the tribes of Asia and the Middle East in the 11 and 1200s, the brutal Mongolian warlord died after either falling off his horse, or being castrated in a violent sexual attack, or an arrow wound from battle, or an infection, potentially even the bubonic plague.
So when we're looking at sources for things like Genghis Khan and his death, understand that you often have more contemporary sources, people writing close to the time when these things happened. And then 50, 100, 200, 300 years later, you have kind of revisionist versions of the stories. A great example of this are the stories about Edward II in England, who was probably like starved to death or something along those lines. But years later, because of accusations that he had been homosexual, there was a story that came out that they had shoved a red-hot poker up his anus, and that was how he was killed. And there's really no reason to believe that's what happened. It's just somebody along the line thought it would make a really cool story to say it that way.
It's believed those closest to him tried to keep his legendary status after death by intentionally sharing conflicting reports of how he died.
Yeah.
As time had gone on, though, more and more experts believed the plague may have been to blame. Spread by bacteria-carrying fleas that infested rodents, or by the coughs and sneezes of sufferers, the bubonic plague causes lymph nodes to swell, ooze pus, as well as high fevers and headaches. Oddly enough, the bubonic plague still exists, though it's not common and these days can easily be treated with antibiotics. Kim Il-sung was...
Think about that for a minute. Think about the simple treatments that we have today that would have been just absolute world changers hundreds of years ago. I mean, presidential assassinations in the United States. William McKinley and James Garfield easily survived with modern medicine. I mean, Garfield would have survived with medicine of the day if he had been treated by a decent doctor. Bubonic plague comes in and kills 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's population at one point. Easily treated with antibiotics. Game-changing stuff. Makes me wonder what things we have today, like cancer, that maybe someday are easily treated, and people look back at how many people died that didn't need to if the cure had been there.
The revolutionary dictator of North Korea, using force to maintain an iron grip over the nation for nearly 50 years. According to defectors and spies, Kim used prison camps and an obedient police force to make opponents of the state disappear, leaving family and friends forever confused as to what happened to them. He was also one of history's most effective leaders in his use of propaganda.
It's crazy to think that I was in high school. I was a senior in high school when this guy died. It's some history seems so ancient, and I get it. I was in high school 30 years ago, so kind of ancient at this point. But I mean, we think of like Kim Jong-il and Kim Jong-un, these people, as like, super disconnected from the founding dynasty of North Korea, but they're really not. I mean, this is all stuff that happened in my lifetime.
For instance, North Koreans were told that he actively fought in 10,000 battles against the Japanese, including 4,774 in just 1 year.
Wow, 10 battles a day.
13 battles a day.
Yeah.
An obvious lie. According to North Korean state media, so take this with a grain of salt, Kim Il-sung died of a myocardial infarction, aka a heart attack, and is still considered the country's eternal president. Kim Jong-il took over for his tyrannical father, and things only got worse. Along with maintaining traditions of silencing dissent at all costs, the transition of power from Kim to Kim caused an already feeble North Korean economy to completely flounder, resulting in a devastating famine, which the government preferred to proudly call the Arduous March, outlawing the very use of the term famine. Also, like his father, Kim died from a heart attack while aboard a train.
Kim suffered a heart attack due to the, quote, great mental and physical strain caused by his uninterrupted building of a thriving nation.
He was working so hard at making this great nation for you that he is a martyr for the nation. He died for you. I mean, fascinating. Actually, if you want to really have some cool insight into North Korea, there have been some people lately who have gone into North Korea and made some great YouTube videos about it. I've watched a few of them recently. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Though conspiracies and doubts continue to swirl, is it possible to get community notes on a whole country? Joseph Stalin was the dictator of the Soviet Union. A title.
Watch the movie Death of Stalin. You won't regret it.
he held for about 3 decades, overseeing the death of anywhere from 6 million and 60 million people through political imprisonment, famine, and other violations of human rights. He died in 1953 at the age of 74 from a massive hemorrhagic stroke involving his left cerebral hemisphere, likely caused by a lifetime of unregulated hypertension or high blood pressure. He suffered from blockages in his arteries, leading to vascular dementia, and there is a theory that this may have exacerbated his temper, which became even more extreme with age.
I think there's a lot of theories like that, and there's something to that. When you look at how many times Caligula, Henry VIII, another example, had a severe injury from a jousting match, and it's later on then in his life after that that he's dealing with health problems, he gets very fat, and he seems to get increasingly intemperate. And I think there's probably something to that. But in Joseph Stalin's case, kind of always like that. I don't know. I mean, unless it happened when he was really, really young.
When one of his doctors suggested the dictator start to take things more easily, Stalin grew furious and had him arrested. To think that I'm afraid of getting a bad patient review. According to Soviet reports, Stalin was found by his staff collapsed on the floor of his private home after a night of usual heavy drinking. He was making some noises and had actually wet himself. Efforts were made to keep him alive, such as putting a cold compress on his forehead and sponging him with vinegar, putting leeches on the backs of his ears.
Here's the issue with Stalin, and this is something I've talked about before. When you rule by that level of fear, even treating you medically becomes an object of fear. Like, what if I treat him and he recovers, but he feels like I didn't treat him well enough and he blames me for his lack of a full recovery? I'm not getting involved. Or the fact that he just simply purged a lot of the best doctors in Moscow in the first place. Nobody was going to step up and say, I'll be the guy that helps him, because they're all afraid.
And despite those medieval efforts, he had a blood pressure of 190/110, and he passed after just a few short days.
Jeez.
Conspiracists claim that this was not, in fact, a stroke that killed him, but rather a poisonous dose of warfarin, a blood thinner often used as rat poison, citing that there was evidence of hemorrhaging in the stomach as he died. Which to me sounds par the course, given that alcoholism can cause those very symptoms to occur. In a strange twist, there's a comedy movie written about this whole fiasco called The Death of Stalin. It's actually pretty good. Check it out if you're...
Oh, it's really good. It's a dark comedy. It's fantastic. The actors in it are phenomenal. And it actually, while being a comedy and therefore playing certain things up, I mean, it gets a lot of the main storyline right.
Saddam Hussein was the dictator of Iraq for over 20 years, using his power to proliferate war throughout the Middle East in endless and bloody campaigns with Iran, Kuwait, and others. After 9/11, which Saddam may or may not have had something to do with, a coalition of
most likely did not, but
Western nations helped topple his regime, and he went into hiding, eventually surrendering as he was pulled from a spider hole in the ground outside an Iraqi farm. He was ultimately convicted by the new Iraqi government and was sentenced to death by hanging. Days later, he was brought to the gallows before a screaming, angry crowd who watched him hang from a noose. Muammar Gaddafi was the dictator of Libya for over 40 years, who took control of the country through a military coup in the 1960s. He was deeply involved in international politics, propping up terrorist organizations all around the world. To fight off political protests,
yeah, honestly, Gaddafi much more involved with terrorism than Saddam Hussein was. Saddam Hussein mostly just confined his terror to his own people.
Gaddafi ordered protesters to be shot and bombed. Classic dictator move. It didn't work though, as in 2011, armed protesters eventually toppled his regime, forcing him to run. In the chaos, one of Gaddafi's bodyguards threw a hand grenade at the militia behind him. It bounced off the concrete wall and exploded in the midst of the leadership circle, killing Gaddafi's defense minister and wounding Gaddafi himself. The militia was then able to catch up and abused him to near death. By the time he was loaded into an ambulance, his body seemed lifeless. It's unclear whether he died from this violence, shrapnel wounds, or from humiliating acts his captors tortured him with that I won't mention here.
Yeah, I had never heard the part about the grenade being thrown. That's interesting, but that was a pretty big deal at the time that all went down.
Idi Amin took over as president for life in Uganda after a military coup in the 1970s. He dramatically transformed the country as soon as he took office, kicking out all Asian people from Uganda and beginning a process of jailing, torturing, and killing perhaps upwards of 300,000 people. This wasn't just your run-of-the-mill dictator killings though, as Amin kept the heads of his murdered opponents in a refrigerator at his home, setting them up around his dinner table and speaking to them. When asked about rumors of this supposed cannibalism, he didn't deny it, instead saying to reporters, "I don't like human flesh, it's too salty for me."
That may be one of those things where he recognized the power of a good myth, so to speak. I don't know enough about Idi Amin's story to know whether he actually did this or not.
Early military records indicate that he failed to get treatment for the venereal disease. That was a consequence of his voracious sexual appetite, causing many to speculate that his erratic behavior was caused by late-stage syphilis, which can spread to the brain. His sickening reign didn't last long though, getting overthrown after just 8 years. He fled Uganda with his multiple wives, mistresses, and 30 children, and was granted safe haven in Saudi Arabia, who promised him sanctuary and a healthy paycheck just to lay low and not get involved in politics. He agreed to these terms until 1989. Amin snuck out of Saudi Arabia with a fake passport and attempted to sneak back into Uganda by flying into the neighboring nation of Zaire, now called the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
This doesn't surprise me. This is like what Napoleon did, right? I mean, some people just, once they've tasted power and that kind of authority, it's really hard for them to walk away from it. And they'll do absurd things to get back to that chance at power.
Despite his best efforts at McLovening his way back to Uganda, he was stopped and eventually returned to Saudi Arabia, where he fell into a coma before dying from kidney and other organ failures in 2003. His story is truly horrible, and it's actually detailed in the movie The Last King of Scotland, for which Forrest Whitaker won an Oscar. Check it out. Fidel Castro was the revolutionary leader of Cuba and one of the highest profile communist dictators of the 20th century.
This is another great example of how recent so much of our history is. 2016, I mean, it's not even been 10 years since Fidel Castro died. Now, he wasn't still ruling Cuba at the time he died. I think his brother had taken over by that point, but I mean, he lived to be 90 years old.
After seizing power of Cuba in 1959, Castro drove the nation into an oppressive communist dictatorship, taking control of nearly all private industry and ultimately turning Cuba into one of the poorest countries on earth.
Cuba would have been such an incredibly wealthy and prosperous place, I think, had this not happened. I mean, because there was a lot of American investment going on there. A lot of people were vacationing there.
Castro eventually died at 90 years old, ceding control of Cuba to his younger brother. His demise was in spite of Castro's own doctor, a specialist in longevity, suggesting in 2004 that he could live to 140. Only Brian Johnson was around back then. His cause of death, though, was never disclosed by the Cuban government. It was probably due to complications related to Parkinson's, which is a neurodegenerative disease that affects mobility, causes a resting tremor, and ultimately exacerbates underlying vulnerabilities and causes serious complications. Mao Zedong was a Chinese revolutionary and the founder of the current Chinese Communist Party. In 1959, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward, a political and social movement to modernize their communist government.
At some point, we need to do a dedicated video about the Great Leap Forward, because this is one of the least talked about mass, I mean, not really genocide, but mass death scenarios in human history. And it doesn't get talked about nearly as much as so many of the others.
It was a disaster, resulting in the worst famine in human history, killing around 30 million people.
I mean, think about that. How much do we talk about the Holocaust that killed, I mean, we say the number 6 million, but that was Jews. I mean, you have millions more of other groups of undesirables, Bolsheviks, Russians, homosexuals, the infirmed, people with mental health issues, and people with birth defects, all those kinds of things. You're still talking 10 to 15 million people, still talking less than half of what the Great Leap Forward killed.
Death is a bit murky though. Some claim he died of a heart attack after years of chain smoking. Others say China was hiding the fact that he had been battling Parkinson's disease or ALS. In all likelihood, it's possible that he suffered from all of the above when he died at the age of 82. Ivan the Terrible was the first Tsar of Russia and worked to establish the empire as a centralized system that was part of Europe. Okay, that doesn't sound so bad for a guy named Ivan the Terrible. So why the aggro nickname? Well, he created a secret police force called the Oprichniki that operated with near complete immunity to collect taxes on their subjects, executing those who failed to comply. Oh, and he murdered his own son, ending his bloodline, giving Russia no heir to the throne, and sending the empire spiraling through years of turmoil known as the Time of Troubles. What a nickname. Then one day in 1584, at the age of 53, he was setting up pieces on a chessboard, turned faint, and died from a stroke. That being said, in 2002, tests on his remains buried at the Kremlin showed he contained more than enough arsenic and mercury to kill a man, meaning he may have also been poisoned.
Yeah, that said, and I don't know that this was necessarily the case at the time of Ivan IV, but there have been stories and situations where people have taken things like arsenic as like a drug addiction, like it had a similar effect on people to LSD, and they would increase the dose as time went on because their body would build up a tolerance to it. But the withdrawal from that was so severe that you would die from the withdrawal. There's a famous case, James Maybrick, who came back to prominence 20, 30 years ago because people said that he was Jack the Ripper, and they had this Ripper diary that was found in the floorboards of a house in Liverpool. And Maybrick had been addicted to arsenic. And when he died and they found arsenic in his system, his American wife was convicted for his murder. And it was many years later that she was finally released, and it turned out Florence Maybrick probably didn't kill him at all because she probably wasn't poisoning him.
Vlad the Impaler was a warlord in Eastern Europe who got his nickname for exactly that, impaling his enemies on long poles, once leaving 20,000 of them to die as a deterrent to the Ottoman Empire. To assert his dominance, he once decided to hold a banquet and invited hundreds of members of rival families. He then had his guests stabbed and their still twitching bodies stuck on spikes. And you thought the Red Wedding was bloody. Ultimately,
Vlad was not Dracula, although, I mean, that was his nickname, but he's not, just because he has the nickname doesn't mean he was a vampire and all that stuff.
Vlad was slain in battle and fully beheaded. His skull was delivered to the Ottoman capital of Constantinople as a trophy. Oddly enough, his legal name was Vlad III Dracula, which some say actually inspired Bram Stoker's Dracula, the vampire.
The name did.
Queen Mary I might not ring a bell, but that's because she also has a more popular nickname, Bloody Mary. She became the Queen of England for a short time and used her powers to reestablish Roman Catholicism as the official religion of the land.
So, context here, she's the eldest surviving child of Henry VIII. The only surviving adult child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. She's fiercely Catholic, and of course her father breaks the church away from Rome, though he always considered himself to be a good Catholic. He just didn't want to be under the authority of the Pope. And the country's becoming increasingly Protestant, especially after Henry dies and his son Edward becomes king. Edward dies at 15, 16 years old. And then Mary becomes queen. She's married to King Philip of Spain, who's also staunchly Catholic. And you got to understand that Catholics had been persecuted under Edward VI. And now Mary comes, and she's kind of returning the favor.
Opposing it meant heresy, and hundreds of criminals were hanged from gibbets or burned at the stake. Gaining power didn't even bring her much happiness either, as she was depressed over being unable to have children, which may have been caused by an ovarian cancer.
Yes, which is probably what killed her, and she actually had a phantom pregnancy where she was convinced she actually was pregnant. She was only in her 40s when she died. But understand that a lot of the reason why we think of Mary as Bloody Mary, and we don't remember, say, Elizabeth or Edward as being Bloody Elizabeth or Bloody Edward, is because there was a concerted effort by the Protestants of the era to paint Catholics as being these bloodthirsty, awful people who murdered anyone who disagreed with them, even though many Protestants did the same thing to Catholics.
Also have been the cause of her death at just age 42, though others speculate it was due to the flu that ravaged England around the same time. Napoleon Bonaparte was the self-proclaimed emperor of the French who rose to power in the military through hard work and a military coup. He stampeded across Europe, killing hundreds of thousands in his efforts to conquer the continent before fumbling the bag trying to win a ground campaign against the Russians in the winter.
To be fair, it's obviously much more complicated than that. Most of the early wars involving Napoleon and the rest of Europe were declared by those other countries, and Napoleon, to his credit, for most of his early reign, was doing his level best to just live at peace with everybody, and they just would not accept Napoleon as emperor in France. And one of the reasons why he ended up agreeing to become an emperor, and obviously he had a lot of ambition, I'm not trying to say he didn't, is because there were a lot of attempts on his life, and he wanted to ensure that there was some kind of succession in place. So yes, I am a bit of a Napoleon apologist, but he absolutely screwed the pooch later in his reign and made a lot of fatal mistakes.
Rookie mistake. He was captured by the British just after abandoning escape plans to America. Though many agreed he should be executed for his war crimes, his opponents in Britain feared doing so would make him a martyr and create an uprising, so rather than hang him from the gallows, they banished him to the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean under the watchful eye of British authorities.
So this was his second banishment. First, he was exiled to Elba, which was in the Mediterranean, not far away, and he was basically allowed to be the dictator of Elba and remain kind of a monarch, but this time, no such luck.
After living there for several years, Napoleon began to feel a mysterious stomach pain, which lingered for years until he died. The doctors who conducted his autopsy in 1821 concluded that his death was from stomach cancer, resulting in bleeding gastric ulcers after a huge dose of calomel, a remedy containing mercury that was given to him just the day before his death. Osama bin Laden was the founder of the militant terrorist group Al-Qaeda and was responsible for overseeing the terror attacks against the United States on 9/11. Despite his enormously high profile, bin Laden managed to evade the US military for a decade after 9/11.
Yeah, the US had him cornered in Tora Bora that first winter there in 2001 after 9/11, but it's a fascinating story, but he gets away.
Navigating mountainous regions of Afghanistan and Pakistan, and all despite the US placing a bounty on his head of $25 million. The international manhunt came to an end in 2011 when President Barack Obama announced on live television
that the United States has conducted an operation that killed Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda.
I remember that night vividly, and I got to give a lot of credit to Barack Obama when you study that whole case and what was presented to him and what the options were. There could have been a lot of other options, and people like Joe Biden, for example, advised him not to send in the raid. Other people were advising him just to drop some cruise missiles on it, but to his credit, they pulled it off, and it could have gone very badly, but it didn't.
According to the United States, bin Laden died of gunshot wounds to the head and chest, though there were some conflicting accounts from Navy SEALs on the mission who claim it's possible that he was already dead when they arrived. To fuel further controversy, the US claims to have taken his body to Afghanistan to positively ID him and prepare him for burial in conformance with Islamic precepts and practice. However, he was abruptly buried at sea, being placed in a weighted bag and dropped into the water from the vessel's deck. Officials said this was to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. Of course, the DNA evidence has never been made public, nor have any photos or videos of this burial.
Yeah, but that said, I mean, even Al-Qaeda acknowledged that it happened. I mean, there's no real dispute that Osama bin Laden was killed that night.
40 US presidents have also died. Some of their deaths were extremely controversial. Click here to check that out, and as always, stay happy.
Yeah, we did that video, so I'll throw up a link on the screen here in just a second. You can check that one out as well. Let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Thanks for watching.